and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana, 104.5 FM. I will be your host for this evening, if I can get this microphone to work. Hey, that works. Hey, just kick it. All right, let me start over again now that I have some sound here. Good evening and welcome. It is time for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana, 104.5 FM. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I am here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. I am here to let you know that views expressed are those of the speakers, and I am here to let you know that those views are not intended to represent WRFU, UCIMC, the Urbana Socialist Forum, or as we like to say on the TV version of this show, UPTV. These views are our own, and by our, in this instance, I mean myself, myself, and I, the three of us, and anyone whose article I happen to be reading at any given moment while I'm on the air. Yeah. So welcome. It's freezing in here, although it is not hot outside or cold outside, which is very weird. It's kind of nice in between weather out there, and not bad at all. But for some reason, the building thinks it's really hot outside because it's really, really cold in here. I'm actually almost wishing I had a jacket. That's how cold it is. So if I start shivering at some point, it's not fear of the topic of immigration or fear of immigrants, for that matter. It is just plain cold. I'm just cold. And that's not something you hear people say very often in Illinois in July. I don't know if I've ever said that on the 4th of July, ever. I can remember being on the verge of heat prostration on many occasions, where I was just like so hot that I thought I was going to die. Obviously, I wasn't going to die, but I thought I was because I was so hot. But no, today is actually outside. It's just perfectly nice, comfortable, no big deal one way or the other. So yeah, it is 4th of July. And so this is the 4th of July edition of CU Immigration. And it might be an interesting point to sort of take a look at this country, United States of America, its history of immigration, and our current approach to or attitude about immigration. So I will begin by reading a very short thing. This is from News 4SA, San Antonio, in case you're wondering, entitled 4th of July Rally to End Immigration Discrimination. Si se puede, the crowd chanted. Yes, it's possible, were the words to support to fix the immigration system during an immigration reform rally held this 4th of July. We have our elected officials, past and present here, giving a lot of support to what we're doing so far, said Tony Mandujano, a U.S. Army veteran. They were told, you have 48 hours to report to camp, said Bexar County Judge Peter Sakai. The only way my dad got out of there was to join the military and serve his country. Sakai was speaking about how Japanese Americans, including his family, faced anti-immigration discrimination during World War II. Started during the Gulf War, then going all the way to the War on Terror, said Mandujano about his time serving our country. The room was full of Latino veterans who were showing their support of ending immigration discrimination on a day we celebrate what makes our country great. Keep our nation strong, said Mandujano. So I thought that was sort of an interesting intro just to give you a couple of different points of view to this article here, which is entitled, The U.S. Has Come a Long Way Since Its First Highly Restrictive Naturalization Law. This is from PRI.org. So for much of U.S. history, citizenship eluded many Americans, and while many still seek citizenship, the number of new citizens is impressive. More than 7,000 people will become American citizens before the end of this 4th of July weekend. Like the cookouts, the parades, and the fireworks, it's become an annual tradition. Every year, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services marks the anniversary of American independence with naturalization ceremonies across the country at the nation's most storied historic landmarks. Yet the country's first law regulating the naturalization of foreign-born Americans, the Naturalization Act of 1790, established a precedent that would have made it impossible for most of today's immigrants to become American citizens. In order for someone to apply for citizenship under the Naturalization Act of 1790, they needed to have lived in the country for at least 2 years. They also had to be a free white person and prove they had behaved as a man of good moral character. Still a standard of today's naturalization law, a distinction that continues to raise questions for immigrants and lawyers alike. The Declaration of Independence pronounced that all men are created equal, but many of them, including Native Americans, free African Americans, slaves, indentured servants, and Asians, weren't equal enough to become American citizens under the Naturalization Act of 1790. Naturalization laws have changed many times over the course of American history. On this 240th celebration of American independence, we will present you with a summary of those changes right here. So from 1795 to 1802, from 2 years to 14 years of required residency. Congress revised the Naturalization Act of 1790 several times in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The most significant changes were to the length of time an immigrant needed to live in the United States before applying for citizenship. Whereas the 1790 law required immigrants to have lived in the U.S. for only 2 years before seeking citizenship, growing anti-immigrant sentiment manifested in a 1795 law that changed the residency requirements to 5 years. When the U.S. faced war with France several years later in 1798, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. This suite of immigration laws permitted the imprisonment and deportation of immigrants, suppressed free speech among immigrants, and spiked the minimum residency requirement for naturalization from 5 to 14 years. The Naturalization Law of 1802 repealed the 1798 Act's 14-year residency requirement and reduced it back to 5 years. Yet continued concern about immigration cemented naturalization as a subject of debate, culminating with the Know Nothings, an overtly anti-immigrant political party popular in the 1840s and 1850s, and their campaign to raise the residency requirement to a whopping 21 years. Although the Naturalization Act of 1790 and subsequent laws were written in a way that suggested citizenship was only available to immigrant men, historian Marion L. Smith explains in an article for the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration that gender was not a major factor, in theory, if not always in practice. An act of Congress passed on February 10, 1855, changed that. Under this new law, a relic of the legal concept of coverture, which mandated that a woman's legal status was subsumed under that of her husband's, a woman who married a native-born or naturalized American citizen automatically became a citizen of the United States, too. Though the 1855 Act formalized a pathway to citizenship for immigrant women, the foundational limitation of citizenship, that only free white person could become a citizen, meant that the 1855 law cemented the denial of citizenship to non-white and enslaved women. Excuse me. Abolition and the end of the Civil War brought sweeping changes to the United States. The 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, formally extended American citizenship to people born in the U.S., including recently emancipated slaves. While the 14th Amendment marked a step forward for African Americans, the Naturalization Act of 1870 explicitly stated that naturalization was only extended to, quote, aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent, end quote. Naturalization remained off limits to all other groups of non-whites who wished to become citizens. The central principle of the 14th Amendment, that anyone born on U.S. soil was automatically a citizen, was put to test in the Supreme Court case Wong Kim Ark versus the United States. Wong's parents were non-citizens, but he was born in the U.S., making him a citizen under the 14th Amendment. Nevertheless, immigration officials tried to bar him from re-entering the country after he returned from visiting family in China. He successfully challenged the federal government's efforts to remove him from the U.S., his native country. The court's decision in his favor was a boon not just for Chinese Americans born in the U.S., but for all American children of immigrants, regardless of their parents' citizenship status. The Expatriation Act of 1907, enacted on March 2nd, demonstrated how tightly wound a woman's legal status was with that of her husband. While an 1855 law granted citizenship to white immigrant women who married American citizens, the Expatriation Act revoked the citizenship of women who married non-citizens, even if they never stepped foot off of American soil. When the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in 1920, their citizenship status and political identity became less tethered to their husbands. The Cable Act of September 22, 1922, followed suit by repealing the Expatriation Act, with one major exception. Female American citizens who married non-citizens of Asian descent could still be stripped of their citizenship. This distinction foreshadowed the November 13, 1922 decision in the Supreme Court case Osawa versus United States, which ruled that Japanese immigrants were ineligible for American citizenship. The 1923 case, United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind, meanwhile ruled that immigrants from India were not considered white and were not only barred from naturalization but could also retroactively have their American citizenship revoked. Congress recognized the service of Native Americans who fought with the United States Army in World War I by offering them American citizenship. On June 2, 1924, President Calvin Coolidge extended citizenship to all Native Americans when he approved the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. Gaining American citizenship was not a clear-cut victory. Rather, the transition to becoming naturalized citizens was part of a much longer history of the U.S. federal government's attempt to coerce Native Americans into abandoning their sovereignty as Native peoples and assimilate into American culture. Some states, meanwhile, reacted to the sudden federal citizenship of Native peoples by restricting their access to voting. Okay, we're up to the 40s. After decades of outright exclusion, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed a law repealing the Chinese Exclusion Act on December 17, 1943. Edward Bing Kan, who entered the U.S. as a student under his original name, Kan Kwong Bing, at the age of 13, became the first Chinese American to become a naturalized citizen after the repeal. It was no coincidence. Kan had been working as an interpreter for the Immigration and Naturalization Service for 35 years. 2 days before Independence Day in 1946, President Harry Truman signed the Luch-Cheller Act into law, allowing Filipino and Indian immigrants to become naturalized citizens. The efforts of civil rights advocates and organizers who lobbied for humane immigration reforms influenced Congress to pass the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. This landmark decision abolished annual quotas that restricted immigrant arrivals according to race and national origin. Nearly 200 years after the Naturalization Act of 1790 limited naturalization to free white persons, the law facilitated the arrival and naturalization of immigrants from parts of the world that were previously limited or barred outright. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 is largely intact and continues to regulate immigration and naturalization today. So I thought this was pretty interesting and pretty appropriate given this 4th of July in terms of talking about our history with immigration, and also looking at the context of immigration as it looks now to us. Because it is tempting to say, oh, it's so screwed up. Our immigration system is so out of whack. How could it possibly be worse? But in the past, it was actually a lot worse. And it's still screwed up, but I think it's the remnants of the history of exclusion and outright racism. I mean, there's no other way to put it. You can describe it all sorts of different ways, but really a lot of this was just racist from the ground up. But it's interesting to visit this because a lot of people, most people celebrate the 4th of July in one way or another. Or they go to fireworks, or they have picnics, or they have the day off, or something like that. And so, like a variety of other holidays, Thanksgiving, for example, that many groups are really not inclined to celebrate in the sense that they're really celebrating where the holiday came from, because it's a holiday, because everybody else seems to be doing it. They go ahead and celebrate it anyway without really thinking too much or too deeply about what is actually going on. So it's interesting to think of how many people, they're totally right about this. Very few of today's new citizens would be able to become citizens if those laws had not been changed over the years. Free white person. Oh, it's just amazing. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting to take a look at. Now, let's look at another aspect of that. So, we have the history now that we've seen of immigration law here in the U.S. We have the current. We opened with the current problems with the immigration system, and people who are fighting against that, demanding that be changed. Now let's see what's going on the other side of this. Here's an article from the LA Times entitled, "Elite Republicans Tried to Ignore Them. Now They're Shaping Donald Trump's Immigration Policy." So for decades, immigration hardliners have felt sidelined and taken for granted by Republican presidential candidates, left with dog whistles and policy crumbs. But Donald Trump's ascent to the top of the Republican ticket has changed their fortunes. Longtime advocates for shutting the door to new immigrants now hold crucial positions in Trump's campaign, and many feel, for the first time in recent memory, they have a candidate who is willing to speak plainly about reducing immigration flows and offers their clearest shot yet at influencing, perhaps even drastically altering, U.S. immigration policy. Joe Arpaio, the Arizona sheriff and poster child for workplace raids and traffic stops, earned a prize seat on Trump's airplane a few months ago, spending hours with his new close friend. Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, the fiercest opponent of GOP-backed amnesty bills in Congress for the last decade, now smiles and demurs when asked whether he might serve as Trump's running mate or settle for a cabinet position. And Numbers USA, long on the fringes of Washington lobbying groups with its stance that legal immigration should be reduced, now crows that all those powerful consultants had it wrong when they insisted that the GOP needed to compromise on raising immigration levels to win a presidential election. Trump broke all the rules, got hammered for it, and just kept going, said Rosemary Jenks, Vice President and Director of Government Relations for Numbers USA. Trump's upending of the Republican establishment has sapped clout from many who are used to having it, and empowered others who had grown accustomed to the margins. Nowhere is that reordering more pronounced than the immigration debate, in which Trump's rise has exposed a widening gap between the party elites and stalwart allies such as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and its voters. Trump's ascent vindicates those who argue that working-class voters see immigration as a threat to financial security. But the political argument has only been proved in Republican primaries, meaning Trump's allies in the immigration policy community could lose their influence if he is defeated in the general election, in which a large Latino turnout favoring Hillary Clinton could doom the GOP candidate. For now, allies such as Arpaio, the Maricopa County sheriff whose controversial immigration enforcement tactics prompted an investigation from President Obama's Justice Department, are relishing the moment. Arpaio said he received a note from Trump 3 years ago because of their mutual interest in questioning Obama's birthplace, an unfounded conspiracy theory, but did not meet the candidate in person until a year ago, when he introduced Trump at a campaign rally in Phoenix. Recently, Arpaio's ailing wife received an uplifting 6-minute phone call from Trump. Arpaio said he has endorsed Republicans in prior presidential elections, but never with the same fervor. He doesn't need to go through my wife to hook me, Arpaio said. He had me hooked to begin with. Sessions may have the deepest ties to Trump among anyone in Congress. In January, one of his top aides, Stephen Miller, became Trump's senior policy advisor. Miller, 30, with thinning hair that lends an air of gravitas, has not only become influential in Trump's campaign, he has unexpectedly emerged as one of Trump's most fiery warm-up acts, earning him a cult following among Trump's ardent backers. Everybody who stands against Donald Trump are the people who've been running this country into the ground, Miller said during a recent Dallas rally, waving his hand from behind a lectern. They're the people who've been controlling the levers of power. They're the people who are responsible for our open border, our shrinking middle class, for our terrible trade deals. Everything that is wrong with this country today, the people opposing Donald J. Trump are responsible for. Miller, who did not respond to a request for a comment, would likely assume a key role in a Trump administration. The firebrand has helped position Trump as the furthest right on the issue within a primary field that was already hardline. During a rally in April, he called Texas Senator Ted Cruz, one of the most conservative members of Congress, an Obama ally who backs a radical policy of mass migration. Though many Republicans in Congress have held out against efforts to bring legal status to millions of immigrants who entered the country illegally, the party's presidential nominees have been willing to compromise. Miller grew up in Santa Monica in the shadow of President Reagan's 1986 immigration overhaul, which tightened border security while granting amnesty to nearly 3 million immigrants who had already crossed illegally. The last Republican to hold the Oval Office, George W. Bush, tried but failed to pass an overhaul that would have granted a path to legal status for 12 million such immigrants. His chief Senate ally on the issue, Arizona Republican John McCain, won the party's presidential nomination in 2008 before renouncing his own bill. Mitt Romney, the 2012 nominee, called for self-deportation, in part to assuage conservatives who were concerned about his prior support of Bush's overhaul. President Bush pushed for an amnesty bill at that time that the American people rejected, Senator Sessions said. Trump's on the other side. I don't think anybody has articulated as effectively the impact that this lawlessness is having on wages and security of people, Sessions added. Sessions was among Bush's chief antagonists in Congress and fought the issue again in 2013 when Republican leaders pushed their party to craft another overhaul with Obama. The plan, which died in the House after Senate approval, was prescribed in a post-mortem that followed Romney's 2012 loss, amid concerns from party leaders that the GOP could no longer compete in national elections unless it changed its tone and passed an overhaul that would remove immigration as a political wedge issue. I totally reject that, Sessions said. What people care about, they want economic growth. They want wages to go up. Sessions said he backs Trump on almost every aspect of his immigration rhetoric, though he talks more about the nuts and bolts of crafting policy, working your way through achieving the goals in a practical manner. Sessions' allies at Numbers USA are only slightly less trusting in Trump, noting that on some issues they care about, such as curbing the guest worker program, he has made inconsistent statements. They also view Trump's persistent call for a border wall as a symbolic catchphrase that is less important to enforcement than electronic verification for workers and systems that track entry and exit. Jenks and Chris Chemensky, Director of Content and Activism for Numbers USA, said they have not had direct contact with the Trump campaign. Yet the influence of Sessions and Miller gives them a confidence they have never had in a presidential candidate. The biggest problem with the immigration issue is people don't know how to talk about it, said Jenks. For that, she credits Trump, even though on some issues, the Muslim stuff, the group does not take a position. Trump proposed a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States, which he called temporary, in December. He and his campaign have suggested a softening of that position in recent days, but have not explicitly changed or revoked his position. Nor does Numbers USA support mass deportations, which Trump has said he would instigate. Yet many Republicans remain concerned that Trump's appeal to white working-class voters will not sustain the party in national elections. Representative David Valdayo, whose Central Valley district is 71% Latino, said last week that he won't support Trump, joining some Republican lawmakers in South Florida who represent districts with large Latino populations. Representative Mario Diaz-Balart, a Florida Republican who has worked with Democrats for years on immigration overhaul, has said he will back Trump, but has not been enthusiastic. In an interview, he blamed Obama and his use of executive authority to halt some deportations for creating resentment among Republicans that empowered some fringe element voices to almost sound like they are in a majority in the GOP. Romney won only an estimated 27% of the Latino vote, and polls suggest that Trump is faring worse. Behind Clinton, 62% to 23% among Latinos in one recent Fox News poll. Many analysts have said Trump would need... What? Oh, wow, that's weird. It just jumped around. Okay, where are we? Okay. Many analysts have said Trump would need votes from 40% of Latinos to win the election. Immigration advocates point to California's Proposition 187, the 1994 ballot initiative intended to crack down on illegal immigration. Voters approved the measure, backed by Republican Governor Pete Wilson, and the party has not recovered from voter backlash in the state. What happened in California many years ago is what is happening in the country now, said Ben Monteroso, executive director of Mi Familia Vota, a Latino advocacy group. Wow, there's just so much wrong with so many things that people have said in here. I'm not even sure I could possibly comment on it all. But you see, when you listen to this, or you don't see it, this is radio, you don't see things. You see it in your mind's eye. That's how you see it. You understand, when you listen to this, how our history of immigration, first of all, how a lot of those things came about and how they were supported and by whom, and that we understand, or we're made aware of the fact that there are people now in government and voters, obviously, since Trump was he basically won the nomination, the Republican nomination. So